Alright, I just unlocked flowers at the homestead. Let's see what we can learn. Oh, wait. 24 minutes? Okay, well, let's go. Okay. Uh, okay. What is even going on here? Uh, genealogy? Okay, 2 traits. That's fine. Okay, what happened to 2 traits? Okay, you have to be trolling at this point. Is this an exam? I don't even know at this point. Okay, let's just check out Matt's roll. Surely it'll be easy, okay? Male parent, red flower. Female parent, white flower. Expected flower mutates into pink flower. Hold on. This is as close as you go to white, and this is red. But the traits are CCDD, and here pink is EE and FF. Huh? Okay, I'm gonna start this off. First of all, flowers are entirely optional. They are basically a long-term investment, and it's more for the fun of actually doing it than necessarily being efficient. But that being said, if you still want to learn flowers, then let's get into it. Also, although I am using pictures for tulips in this example, these technically apply to all the different types of flowers. It's just that roses and hydrangeas take quite a bit more time. I have also made pages for identifying them in the spreadsheet linked below. Starting off, we can talk to Delphine to buy some seeds. Here, you can buy tulip, rose, and hydrangeas. Tulip are the fastest growing, however they sell for the least amount. Rose takes a bit longer to grow, but sells for a bit more than tulips, and hydrangea takes even longer to grow, but sells for a bit more than the rose. Here you can also buy fertilizer, and eventually advanced fertilizer. Fertilizer does not affect the actual genes that you get, however, it does speed up, by a small amount, the actual growth time of the entire plant. And it is entirely not needed unless you want to prioritize speed. Make sure that you only buy the amount of seeds that you will actually use, as holding extra seeds can get very confusing when you go to plant them. The first thing that we will need to do is make sure we set up our fields correctly. Go into the H menu, and then here you can drag the fields around and position them anywhere that you need. Ideally, we start out by doing several plots of 2 fields next to each other. The reason that this is important is that this allows us to start off our journey just like every other great journey, by gambling. By planting 2 fields directly next to each other, we allow the 2 to pollinate off of each other. The seeds bought from Delphine are entirely dominant flowers, usually ending up as red. However, when we plant the 2 next to each other, their recessive genes that they also have can possibly be passed to each other to end up with different shaped or different colored flowers. So plant these flowers in groups of 2, water them, fertilize them if you want, and then let's continue. Let's get into the traits. So starting off, there's 6 total traits. However, when it comes to shape, there's only 2. So starting off with the shape, let's look at this. Here on the left we have the dominant A and dominant B, and then we have the dominant A, recessive B, and then we have the recessive A and dominant B, and lastly we have the recessive A and recessive B. Generally, you want to go for the more recessive traits, it's up to a total of all the 6 traits, in order to obtain the black flowers, the rarest flowers, and usually the ones that sell for the most. I know this seems a bit intimidating, however, stay with me. So we also have 4 different traits that control the actual colors, starting with C, D, E, and F. I could go more in depth, but it's more important to be able to recognize the genes than necessarily how they work. The way to track the actual flower that you have planted is best obtained by simply selling it. Firstly, before you harvest, make sure you come here and you sell all flowers that you possibly have, as this makes it easier to tell exactly what flower you just picked up. So if we go here and we pick up a flower, and then I go to sell it, if I go to sell it, then I can immediately see a bigger picture of what it was, and I can also see the price. Make sure you only select the C one so that you can see the base price that it sells for. In the description, I have included a link to the spreadsheet. Here you can see a list of all sell prices and a way to track their traits from their sell prices. Simply match, first of all, the shape that the actual flower is. So this is a recessive A and a dominant B flower. Now, let's look at the price. So the price it sells for is 46 Homestead coins. So we go back to the spreadsheet and we find the one that is the correct shape, and it sells for 46 Homestead coins. As you can see, there is two. However, this is pretty rare. And as we can tell, it is obviously a white flower. So we now know that the flower that we have is number 6. Well, the genes for number 6 are recessive C, recessive D, dominant E, possibly. Reminder, the other half of these traits can be recessive. So for these, we will mark this down. So reminder, we have this flower right here, which is an AAB. The other B is possibly recessive, so we mark it as an underscore. Then we move on, and since this was 6, we have the 4 other traits of recessive C, recessive D, and dominant E and F. However, once again, we are not know for sure that these are double dominant, so they could possibly be dominant recessive or entirely dominant. So now we have the actual genealogy of the flower that we harvested. Back in the field, we have this set up so that way we can track which seeds came from which field. So we have our genealogy, and we can put it here. This allows us to track it through multiple growth cycles. Now that we know the genes of the seed we just harvested, it is important that we plant it immediately, as having multiple different seeds makes it hard to keep track of what seed you are actually going to plant the next time you plant. Earlier, I mentioned a bit about gambling for the better traits from the very beginning. The ideal plant that we go for is actually something that is preferably almost entirely recessive. One of the ways that we can go about doing this is by selectively selling and destroying the seeds of the very dominant traits. This, for one, is one that is entirely dominant. So, planting these again would not be very good for us. So, we can sell them, and then we can replant their seeds. And then we go into the H menu of the building, and we simply recycle the field with the seed inside. This will destroy the plant, and you will not get the seed back, so make sure you only do this on the ones that you want to destroy. Then we bring out the field again, replace it, and we simply go back and we buy another fresh seed. Simply replant it, and hopefully we get lucky again next time. This other flower has 2 recessive traits. However, we want to shoot for something that has at least 4. This will eventually come, but it might take a little bit. You might have to reroll a few times. So we will destroy this one and replant it again. In my opinion, it is only worth replanting seeds which have 3 or more recessive traits. However, when you end up with 4 or 5, preferably 5, it is best to plant it by itself and let it fully grow. Do not have any others around it, or you'd possibly corrupt some of your recessive traits. There are 2 ways to pollinate from a flower. One way, which we already know, is by proximity. However, how do we ensure that we do not mess up the heavily recessive genes that we have selected out, which have 4 or 5 recessive genes? Well, one way we can do this is by simply letting it grow and not touching it. Then we can go into edit mode, and we can take other flowers and we can place them around our best flower. They need to be in the direct directions and cannot be diagonal. However, they need to be within 1 full tile of the main, and so we can simply arrange them around the main flower within 1 tile, and they will all pollinate off of the main flower. So now all of these 4 flowers will pollinate off of this heavily recessive flower, so long as we do not harvest this and replant it, but leave it as fully planted. It will always be able to pollinate the nearby flowers, ensuring that we do not corrupt our heavily recessive flower but instead use those heavily recessive genes to grow more flowers like it. When it comes to sharing your homestead, there are some important things to note before we talk about pollination. The main thing is that people who share your homestead, who are your roommates, do not also get to plant their own flowers. The amount of flower plots is limited entirely by the homestead level, and the people who plant the flowers first are the only people who can harvest it and sell them. So it is advised not to be roommates with your friends if your friends also want to do flowers. Okay, here's an example of what it looks like when you are the roommate trying to pollinate the flowers. You first gather the pollen from the active plant that you want to pollinate from, essentially the parent, and then you just walk over to another one which is in the pollination stage, and you apply the pollen. And normally, as this one is out by itself, it would not get pollinated by anything because there's no other flowers nearby, but since we are manually pollinating it, it will eventually grow to be pollinated by the flower that we took the pollen from. And as you can see, a red flower is turning into a white flower, even though there's nothing around it for it to pollinate automatically off of, and is just the pollen that we took. You can utilize this pollination to effectively pollinate more than just 4 flowers from the same flower. You can take the pollen and pollinate other flowers, which will eventually become like the flower we pollinate from over time. Now let's discuss the end goal. The end goal is to create flowers which are fully recessive except for one dominant recessive color gene, or by keeping a black flower and through testing determining if it is an A recessive, B recessive, black flower. It is important to note that legendary flowers are black flowers which have all recessive color genes in C, D, E, and F. Also, they do not give their seeds when harvested. As such, you should only harvest them when you have good flowers already, as you can always pollinate off of them to receive recessive color genes. When you have a flower with 5 recessive traits, try to pollinate off of it using other flowers. If the flowers eventually become black seeds or black flowers, then you know that you have a max flower, as this guarantees that the last gene is dominant recessive, which means that given time, all of the flowers around this will eventually become black flowers. However, if after many replants you are stuck with all of the same flower, then you know that you have a fully dominant last gene. In this case, the only way to solve it is really just by chance. So what you do is you make a whole bunch of the same genes, because eventually you will end up at the same gene by breeding it with the center one, and then you take these genes, or you take these flowers, and you try to breed it with something that has a recessive of your last gene. If you end up where you pollinate the purple one off of the blue one, and you end up with the same color the next time you harvest it, then you know that this is a max flower, as the only possibility is that it is dominant recessive in the last gene. If you end up with the wrong flower, then you just need to keep breeding until you get one that maintains its appearance but has bred with this one. At that point, you will have the max flower. Also, some flowers will become black flowers as they will inherit all of the recessive color genes before they inherit the shape genes. Therefore, these max flowers will produce the other shapes as well. This leads you to get a variety of black flowers if you want them for display. Using these strategies, you can eventually get purple and legendary flowers too. I managed to get purple and legendary flowers in just the span of the CBT, and now on live, I have already gotten a 5 recessive gene flower, and will probably soon have legendary flowers. Almost all of the information for this guide was from the Chinese video linked in the description below. As I cannot speak or write Chinese, I mostly used the graphics for reference and learned everything else through trial and error. So there might be some more efficient ways to do things, which I am not aware of. If you have any suggestions or things that you have found, or if you can read or speak Chinese, feel free to comment below.